Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the second season NBA. Today we have our very first guest. Please welcome on Ron Gutterman. Works with the NBA on their social media side and is also a writer and editor for Laker Nation. Today we're going to be talking about just kind of a general trade deadline preview, the big stories that are standing out to us, and just kind of the teams that have really interested us. So, Ron, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and then we can dive right in?
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me on. Proud to be the first guest. Yeah, so like you said, work for the NBA, social side, doing that a couple years now. Lakers Nation, been there for like God, almost 8 years, writing, editing. Yeah, and I'm excited. This is going to be, I think, a fun trade deadline. There's a lot of intriguing pieces that could get moved. There's a lot of teams that very clearly need to do things. So yeah, I'm excited for the next few weeks to materialize.
Yeah, I think this is a really exciting time. There's a lot of really kind of young, up and coming teams, a lot of teams that have been kind of put in positions where they need to make some moves or have players that seem kind of on the outs or primed to be moved to kind of make some big impacts around the league. I think the first team we're going to dive into today is the Grizzlies. Ja has had a couple of good games now, and overall, it definitely seems like Ja is on the outskirts, kind of looking to be moved himself, and I think the Grizzlies are definitely looking to move him. What do you think the Grizzlies are kind of like looking for in a return? Is it more similar to the Trae Young situation where it's just kind of get off of him at all costs, even if it is just kind of expiring salary coming back? Or could they be asking for more? Does it make sense for them to just keep him long term? What are your thoughts kind of in that realm?
Yeah, I mean it's really tough to for if I'm putting myself in the perspective of the other 29 NBA teams, it's really hard to get around the idea of giving up value to get Ja Morant at this stage. I know he's had a good game or two since he's been back from injury, but I mean it's really beyond the injury stuff. There's just so much smoke around Ja Morant at this stage, and the production on the court has not matched the headlines, the injuries, all the negative stuff. So it's really hard to wrap my head around a team giving up value to get him. Uh, so I think this is really going to be more like a Trae Young situation where a team says, "Let's just get him in the building and see what happens," but we're not giving up anything that's going to harm our long-term future. Um, Even though Ja Morant still has a couple years on his deal.
Yeah, I think kind of as you said, there have been a lot of headlines, and it's just kind of a bit of a toxic brand right now. Almost the more toxic bit is the 2 more years after this year at nearly 43 and 45 million dollars. That's just such a big salary slot to be spending on a player who what was the number? He hasn't played 7 games in a row in a few years now. It's just hard to build a team when you have that kind of big salary slot taken up by someone who's just so inconsistent. And despite that, he still has a bit of an allure as this just super dynamic point guard who can really, at one point was kind of viewed as a potential best player on a really good team. And so I think, unlike Trey, there is a bit of a, I think there's a bit more of an upside case where he does kind of figure it out and kind of can get back to what made him good, even if the athleticism isn't going to be what it ever was once again. One of the teams that's kind of stood out to me as a potential landing spot for Ja that would kind of maybe up their ceiling a little bit is the Raptors. I think they're in a spot where they have some contracts that don't look great long term, and they need a little bit more dynamism on the offensive front to really start to be kind of like a real contending team again, and also have the defensive kind of pieces around him to try to cover up for his big issues.
Yeah, the Raptors are kind of in an interesting spot right now where they're, I think, fourth in the Eastern Conference. Yeah, fourth at 25 and 19. But I think nobody, including them, would think of themselves as a championship contender. I think it's like a nice story. They're kind of their roster is just kind of like a collection of pretty good basketball players. So I do think John Morant going there makes some sense. It gets, another player with like that star upside, even if he hasn't shown it in a while. It's someone with that star upside. Someone, like you said, adds a little bit of athleticism to what they do. Um, I think that's one of the easier teams to make a trade with, where like you could see both teams talking themselves into whatever they're getting in that. And I think for the Grizzlies, it's just moving on and getting something else in the door. But I think there's definitely something there with the Grizzlies and Raptors if they wanted to make that move.
Yeah, I think the big question becomes, or the big question that kind of comes up for the Grizzlies is, if you're moving on from Ja, are you moving on with the sense of, okay, we kind of have to enter a bit more of like a full rebuild, or are they going to try to stick with this group that they have? This, they have some nice young players. Cedric Howard looks really good. They obviously have Jalen Wells, more Cougs. We're now up to 4 Cougs mentioned in this podcast, who all look, young and exciting, but I think they don't really have anyone who really pushes them into being kind of really competitive and exciting. And I think there is a bit of a trap there, and it could end up kind of uninspiring and just kind of mid-tier.
Yeah, I think if you're trading Ja, and I mean, if you're saying it's Toronto and you can look at, what their cap sheet is, Emmanuel Quickly's making 32.5 million, like RJ Barrett's making 27. Like those are the kinds of pieces that are probably going back to Memphis in this case. And you look at a Memphis Grizzlies team that instead of Ja has Emmanuel Quickly and another small salary guy, like, yeah, that's not a very good team. So I think the question the Grizzlies have to ask themselves is how desperate is kind of the wrong word, but like how desperate are you to get rid of Ja that it's we'll continue being mediocre. We'd rather try to build something new around Jaren Jackson Jr. and Cedric Howard and Jalen Wells and the guys that we have? Or is it we only want to get rid of Ja if we feel like we have a clear path to making a playoff contending team?
Yeah, I think if this is kind of something that I kind of recommended with the Trey thing is, if you're going to move off of Ja for essentially expiring, why not use his big kind of salary slot to take on even worse contracts, right? And in that case, like, is taking on Emmanuel Quickly and Jakob Poeltl, could you find something there that makes it worth it for the Raptors to actually give you some sort of assets back to kind of kickstart your next phase? But if you do go that route, it makes way more sense to kind of move on from Jaren and enter kind of a full rebuild. And I think that is not something that the Grizzlies are all that interested in. Which,
Yeah, I mean, I don't see the Grizzlies trading Jaren Jackson after giving him the deal that they gave him this summer,
yeah.
this past summer. So yeah, I think, like you said,
And so if it's not going to be Toronto, what other teams would be even kind of remotely interested in Ja?
yeah, I think the team that's been floated around a bunch is Miami. Miami is kind of people have talked themselves into the idea that Heat culture is exactly what Ja Morant needs, and they can fix him. And they definitely have the ability to make a trade for him that's pretty easy. They have, well, it also partially depends on if the league is going to allow the Heat to trade Terry Rozier's contract.
I mean, I think it'd be really strange for the league to say, no, you can't trade him, right? If they're not going to, to not let him be traded, then also not just kind of expunge his salary would be, I don't know, that just doesn't sit quite right with me. And I also feel like it would be just kind of a unnecessary and like massive hit to the Heat for something that they, are obviously innocent of, or innocent in the
Right. Yeah.
situation.
And I think, well, I agree with you. I think the league is still, I don't know that they've ruled on whether or
Yeah.
not his contract, but I assume, let's assume that it is. There's a pretty easy trade to make there that then gives Memphis a huge benefit because Terry Rozier has, what does he have? 1 year,
Yeah,
26.6 million. So
expiring after this year.
he's an expiring deal. That's a huge win for Memphis to say, okay, we're trading Ja, and now our clear path to improving is that we're gaining a ton of financial flexibility this offseason because we're getting, I mean, what is it? 2 years, 90 million worth of flexibility coming off the books.
Yeah, it doesn't quite open up like max cap space or even like max offer sheet cap space. And I think cap space is kind of turning into a little bit of a trap this offseason where there aren't any super, super high level players. I think the big ones that I would be interested in would be Quentin Grimes and Kobe White, who are both like very, very good players, but not exactly, headlining names for, a contending NBA team.
No, so I would say this is probably like they're not going to have max cap space, but they don't
Yeah.
need max cap space. They just need flexibility to be able to, if they want to go out and get a Quentin Grimes, or if they want to go out and give a couple of really solid role players or really solid players like a reasonable deal. I think that opens up the flexibility to do it when you're not paying two guys 60% of your cap space.
Mm-hmm.
I think it opens up a ton of flexibility. So I see the Memphis Miami rumors to me make a lot of sense just because I see the path to both teams wanting it.
Especially because it could open up max cap space in 27, 28, where all of a sudden you do have a ton of flexibility. You still have Jaren Jackson on a three more years, and KCP comes off the books, and then you could also have that kind of young, kind of mid-level player of Quentin Grimes or whoever you get this offseason. Then you kind of have something that really could be something. You've got your young players in Zach Edey and Cedric Coward kind of really coming into their own and coming towards the end of their rookie contract, so you can bring in another big contract there before extending those guys. I think that is the Heat Memphis kind of the incentives align a lot for those two teams. If the Miami Heat are actually interested in Ja.
Yeah, if they believe that Heat culture can kind of bring him back to what he was a couple years ago, I think Ja and Bam as a duo at their peak is really interesting. I think it's more interesting than Tyler Hero and Bam if Ja Morant is Ja Morant and not whatever version of him we see today. So I think there's a lot there if the Heat are really confident in their culture bringing him back to what he was.
There is a bit of a comedic undertone of Ja going to the Heat after the Heat bring in Noah LaRoche, who was a big proponent or reason that with Ja kind of prickling against the Noah LaRoche offense last season. But
yeah, but
it's just funny. So besides the Heat, are there any other teams that even kind of make remote sense? I'm starting to get the sense that this is heading towards him just kind of making it through this season with the Grizzlies, because it just doesn't quite track with that many teams for them to really be even kind of interested in taking a flyer, because it's not quite the same as the Trey situation, where Trey has that player option for next year and then is essentially off the books, whereas Ja has 2 more years at that like big around 25% of the cap number.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think 2 years ago, if you would have pulled the league, how many of you would want to pay a 28-year-old Ja Morant $45 million, 25% of the cap? I think most teams would be on board for that. But today, that just seems daunting.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a team out there that has the ability to talk themselves into it, especially when you're talking about most of these teams at this point in the season have to give up, $40 million worth of salary just to be able to make a trade work. I think this is one of those situations where, to me, it's either Miami or it's they're holding on to him till the offseason when teams get a little more flexible.
Yeah. Another slight issue with the Miami situation is that it does kind of guarantee that they're paying the tax next season, which I'm not sure if the team I don't know if the risk that the Ja thing doesn't work out, and then you're stuck kind of with a couple really big bloated contracts and just a not very good team.
Yeah.
So to a more positive note, we have a player who is playing really well right now in Michael Porter Jr., who since coming to the Nets has looked maybe not quite the amazing sparkling star that we saw while he was in high school, but has looked really, really good and has really kind of come into his own as a scorer and offensive player in a slightly more central role than he was when he was with the Nuggets. The Nets are clearly in a situation where being bad this year is beneficial, but they also don't have any picks next year, so being competitive next year is something that I think is, obviously very interesting to them. What kind of return would you be looking for Michael Porter Jr. to be willing to move off of him right now?
Yeah, I think Brooklyn is looking for. I mean, it's just picks and young guys, or a contract that was seen as even worse than MPJ's at the time of the trade. I think that's their route here. They still have some cap room to like mess around with if they wanted to trade MPJ for an even bigger number to get an asset out of it. I think they were brilliant to get an unprotected first from Denver for MP to take on the MPJ contract, and I think they could do a similar thing, kind of kicking the can down the road, getting worse and worse contracts so you can get more and more assets. I think trading Michael Porter Jr. makes a ton of sense for the Nets because I think even in a world where they want to be competitive next year, I don't know that Michael Porter Jr. as your best player or your second best player is the path to being competitive next year.
So by that logic, you're saying that you don't think Michael Porter Jr. can be the kind of second best player on a really, really good team. If that's the case, is his number at 38 this year and 48 or 40.8 next year a bit daunting for teams taking him on? I think there are a few situations where it does make a lot of sense, and despite that, it does seem like a lot of those teams are kind of holding back to kind of go for something bigger, and I think we all know who that very, very big man is that everyone's kind of holding on to or holding out for. With that kind of looming over this whole situation, does it make sense for teams like the Warriors or the Pistons or the Heat again to kind of make a big move for Michael Porter Jr.?
I think it does. I think it does make sense because I don't think the Warriors or the Pistons. I don't think the Heat as much, but I think the Warriors and the Pistons. You're slotting Michael Porter Jr. back into a role that he won a championship in. I don't personally think that Michael Porter Jr. can be the best player or the second best player on a championship contending team, but he's clearly proven that he can be the third or fourth best player. So I think if you're putting him in that situation again, there's a really good chance of success there. And I think for both, for the Warriors, I would look at their roster and say, getting Michael Porter Jr. instantly makes you better. And where are you going with the Steph, Jimmy, Draymond core with the rest of the roster looking like what it looks like right now? So that's the argument I would make for the Warriors. And for the Pistons, I think there's a good argument to make that maybe they're just ready as is. You don't need to make any changes. Don't rock the boat. But also, I think Michael Porter Jr. serves as a significant upgrade over some of their most expensive guys, like a Duncan Robinson, a Karis LeVert. That right there. Those two guys are making 21% of the salary cap. I'd much rather have Michael Porter Jr. than Duncan Robinson and Karis LeVert. So that's where it's like I think there's an argument for both teams to make that Michael Porter Jr. makes you a championship contender or at least close to it, and you bite the bullet on what is really a 2-year deal, which is not that bad in the modern NBA.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of space for both of these teams to fit him in, especially because in the Golden State case, he slots in really nicely contract-wise with the way Golden State has their contract set up right now. It would be the matching salary works really well with Jonathan Kuminga, Moses Moody, and Buddy Hield. And he still fits into that kind of 2-year time frame of this year and next year before Golden State pretty much has everyone off the books. I mean, essentially, if they did that, they would be trading 2 of their 3 contracts that they have on the books for 27-28 would be going out in this trade. So they would have essentially, one player who's on a non-guaranteed or contract already under contract for that season. And he does fit, at least offensively, really well with the kind of players that would, he fits in really well. He can do a lot of the, at least offensively only, pretty much. It's a big caveat here. He can do a lot of what prime like Klay Thompson did as this like really, really great off-ball shooter and big kind of cutting threat. So I think if the price is cheap enough, then it does make a lot of sense. But I think the big issue is that any move that Golden State would make right now for Michael Porter Jr. would pretty much take them out of contention for any sort of Giannis trade this offseason.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of a frustrating state of affairs for the NBA is everyone is waiting on Giannis, and Giannis, despite the fact that Giannis continually says, I'm not requesting a trade, it still feels like the entire NBA world is saying, yeah, but you're gonna. And we need to be ready for when you are. And, it's frustrating because I think these teams are missing out on opportunities to improve themselves in the hopes that Giannis wants out and picks them. And I don't know that the Warriors are in the category of like Giannis would for sure pick you, even if he did request a trade.
What's so interesting is we've actually seen this before, right? Like that's essentially what the Miami Heat did a few years ago, where they kind of kept everything back and kind of didn't make any big moves in the hopes that Giannis would hit free agency, and it ultimately ended up not working out for them, right? And so I think I really agree with you, especially for me, the Pistons. The Pistons kind of big slot where they need to upgrade and kind of figure out a long-term solution is that power forward spot for whenever Tobias Harris starts to really become, unplayable and just is no longer capable of being a starter, which we may already be there. Michael Porter Jr. fits in really seamlessly into Tobias Harris's offensive role. And so I think it makes, a lot of sense for Detroit if they want to go for a player, if they're willing to kind of go into the tax next year and kind of really, actually, would that put them into the tax with however much Jalen Duren's going to make? It would put them very, very close to the tax.
It would. I think actually, they would be in the tax.
They would almost be assuredly into the tax. But it does kind of figure out their power forward spot kind of going forward, right? Like that's their now starting power forward for the foreseeable future. And you have this core of Cade Cunningham, Jalen Duren, and Michael Porter Jr., which, I think that's a core that fits together very well on offense. It's a little shaky on defense, but you have a lot of really strong defenders in Asar Thompson and Isaiah Stewart around them to kind of hopefully figure something out. And we've seen Michael Porter Jr. be a part of like a good enough defense to be a really, really good team. So I think there is a world where that makes a lot of sense. One of the other options that I've been thinking about recently is for Detroit on that front is instead of going for someone this trade deadline, waiting for the offseason and going for someone a little bit cheaper, like the currently untradeable but will eventually be tradable PJ Washington, right? He fits in. He's not quite the offensive player, but is a much, much better defensive player and is obviously way, way cheaper. Which of those kind of routes of like maybe we don't figure out the power forward we wait to figure out the power forward position for the long term this offseason, where we have a bit more options and we have it's just more flexible.
If Michael Porter Jr. had 4 years on his deal, I would say just wait, do the cheaper thing. It's why I was super against Detroit making any sort of move for Lauri Markkanen when that was like the heavy rumor. Because I just felt that Lauri Markkanen is never going to achieve what his contract is paying him to do. I don't think he's that kind of player. But Michael Porter Jr., he's expiring next year. Like this is a 2-year deal. So if you get him and it doesn't work, you're done with it by the summer of 2027. You'll have some space. You won't have like a max slot or anything, but you'll have space to like try again to improve the core around Cade Cunningham and Jalen Duren and Asar Thompson. Like, to me, this isn't a all-in move. Like, Lauri Markkanen for Detroit was an all-in move. If they were doing that, that was their big move for the next 4 years. This isn't that. And so I think Michael Porter Jr. makes a ton of sense for them. And that is what I would advise Detroit to do if they were asking my opinion about, going for it with him or waiting for PJ Washington or that type.
So if they do make that move, what are kind of the next if you make that move, the obvious question becomes like, what are the next steps? Like, where does this leave us? What does this put us? What kind of situation does this leave us in? If they're re-signing Jalen Duren, who I think is going to get rather close to the max at this point, they're well into the tax and have still a number of they still actually at that point would have 2 or 3 of these kind of $15 million salaries of Duncan Robinson, Isaiah Stewart, and Karis LeVert to kind of still move and use to fill out the roster and kind of maybe get out of some of the get off some money if they needed to. But I think it really leaves them in a spot where they're very set for this year and next year, and from there things start to open up again. And I think it does make a lot of sense for them to go for something like this because it actually lets them, it just raises their ceiling so much more, like so much, and gives them this kind of, as you said, like it's not a free shot at this, but a very, like, the downside isn't that bad, for like, essentially.
Yeah, I think I mean we're assuming that this trade is Tobias Harris and Jaden Ivey.
Yeah, type it. Yeah, either Jaden Ivey or one of Karis LeVert or Duncan Robinson. I mean, I suppose you could do it with, yeah, it would have to be one of those guys, or you could start lumping together a bunch of $8 to $6 million salaries.
I think the Nets definitely like would talk themselves into Ivy being someone that they could not build around, but like have as a building block as they try to be competitive next year. I think that type of trade makes sense for both sides. And to me, if I'm looking at the rest of this season where the East is as wide open as it will ever be, the Pistons are already first. If you have a starting lineup of Cade, Michael Porter Jr., Asar Thompson, Jalen Duren, whoever's in that, Karis LeVert, whatever.
Yeah.
You're formidable, and you have a real chance to go win the East while it's still as wide open as it is.
Yeah, I think it does fit. He does fit very nicely in, and it does kind of help alleviate some of the kind of big questions that Detroit has coming up. And I think Jaden Ivey is actually, that's a really good point to bring up, is that if you could make kind of the big value portion of this Jaden Ivey going out, because I think he's someone who makes a lot of sense for the Nets as someone who has a lot of, there is some potential there. It hasn't quite worked out. And I think we mentioned this, Jagger and I mentioned this in the Dallas podcast, of when you're in this situation where you don't have that much pick control. And I mean, it's the classic Nets situation where like they have essentially zero pick control and are bad. You have to kind of take these, you have to really be looking for players on the margins who haven't quite worked out somewhere, but do have the talent and the potential to be really good. And I think Jaden Ivey fits that mold really well, where he's been hurt. He just hasn't been able to kind of really establish his career. And so if you can get his restricted rights, keep his, restricted market down, and get him on a, probably a 3 to 4 year deal where it's relatively cheap, maybe even a 3 years with a player option or a team option on the end to kind of keep the value down, getting a shot at like a potential really high level player makes a lot of sense for Brooklyn. So if it is the combination of Duncan Robinson and Jaden Ivey, do you think Brooklyn is asking for any other picks? I mean, I think it would be a little bit far-fetched for them to not ask for any more picks. I think it's going to be at least, one unprotected first and then probably a lotto protected first on top of Jaden Ivey to really entice Brooklyn, because, I mean, I just think there's going to be a number. Like, Michael Porter Jr. seems like one of the more likely players to get moved.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, if I'm the Nets, I don't trade him unless I'm getting an unprotected first round pick or I'm getting a really quality young player that I can start building around. And so obviously you're not getting that in Jaden Ivey, but I do think for the Pistons giving up one unprotected first, like I think if the final trade is Tobias Harris, Jaden Ivey, and one unprotected first, I feel like you can talk yourself into that. Like I don't think that's so daunting that you can never recover from that type of trade.
Yeah, especially if it's this year's first, where they're already, they're quite high up in the standings.
Yeah, that's going to be the 27th pick.
Yeah, at this point it'd be the 29th pick, right? So it's not something that you're, it would be nice to have. But I also I think, unlike a lot of the other teams, I don't think the Pistons are really in the kind of Giannis sweepstakes. I don't think it really lines up with what they're doing, because the matching salary would be so, with Tobias Harris coming off the books, could you do, like, I don't even think a sign and trade to get his salary in there would really make much sense. So it would have to be like Duncan Robinson, Isaiah Stewart, Karis LeVert, Jaden Ivey. It would have to be just this like huge amalgamation of contracts to even get
Yeah.
to the Giannis number, let alone that Giannis doesn't fit particularly well with Jalen Duren, who would also be coming into this huge contract. You know, you'd essentially have three players at 40 to 50 million or whatever Giannis is at this point, 60 something.
Yeah, they're not really a Giannis team, and so they're not in the holding pattern that everybody else is in. Um, yeah, I really like this deal for them. I I hope it's something that they can do because the Pistons, even though they're first in the East right now, I don't think a ton of people are confidently saying Detroit's gonna win the East this year. I think you know New York or even Boston at this point. Um, I think a lot of people would talk themselves into one of those two teams. And I think if the Pistons get MPJ, now you're saying this is a favorite. This isn't just the team that's going to dominate in the regular season and then flame out in the second round. Like, this is the team that's going to win this conference.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think when you're looking at kind of just what Detroit has been as a team this season, I think they're currently second in net rating, but it's been a bit shaky on offense at times. They're very, very dependent on mashing on the offensive boards and getting to the free throw line and finding a way to kind of smooth out their offense and just get some more real like dynamism and just a really like threatening offensive player, which is essentially Michael Porter Jr.'s calling card, right? Like that's what he is in the league to be good at, right? Like that's what he is here to do. And I think that could really kind of up their offense and really push them into that, you know, top 5 on one side, top 10 on the other, classic contender, you know, litmus test.
Yeah, and I think it improves Cade too. Like, Cade is probably never going to be a 50-40-90 guy. But having a 50-40-90 guy like MPJ in the building, like, you could see that 3-point percentage go up to like 37. You could see that field goal percentage go up to 48 because there's more space because it's not just let's pray Cade can do something for us here. That's kind of what their offense is right now.
Yeah. And I think Michael Porter Jr. could fit really easily into the kind of Malik Beasley, just absolute gunner on the wings, especially in transition. Where last season Beasley was just jacking threes in transition. I think Michael Porter Jr. would fit really, really well into that role and kind of get them back to what had their offense singing pretty well last season. The the last of our three kind of big stories before we get into some of the small nitty gritty, you know, cap space stuff that the likes of us really enjoy are the Warriors and just the general Kuminga situation. Obviously, Jagger and I did a whole podcast on Kuminga and the Warriors earlier this season. And in that podcast, we were rather hopeful. We saw some development from Kuminga that apparently has either disappeared or the Warriors did not quite agree with what we saw. And since then, he has been entirely excised from the rotation. And, you know, with the award for the most useless trade demand in the past decade goes to Jonathan Kuminga. But what kind of teams would really be interested in Kuminga at this point? I think Kuminga, like Jaden Ivey, is another one of those players where this could be someone that we can get in for really cheap and kind of actually bring a really good player out of. What teams might be interested in him? Where does it really make sense for the Warriors to move him? Does it really make sense for the Warriors to move him if they're not really getting the right piece in, because he is kind of that big contract slot for them that they could use to trade in the offseason or at next deadline?
Yeah, I mean, the teams that are all interested in Kuminga are, I mean, it's kind of telling. It's all the bad front offices. It's Chicago, it's Sacramento, it's the Lakers. Um, those are kind of the teams that have expressed interest over the last year or so, and I think those are still the teams that would be vying for him. I think if you're the Warriors, at this point, you know you're not going to be able to like stack up Kuminga with Moody and get a superstar the way you probably could have 2-3 years ago. So at this point, I think you're not playing Jonathan Kuminga at all. You need to get someone in the door who you can play because with your rotation being as old as it is, as thin as it is, you need players who can play today. And so I think they're I don't think they view themselves as desperate, but if I was them, I would be desperate to make a deal so that I can get more basketball players that I feel comfortable playing nightly.
Yeah, especially because in a lot of the deals for like potential deals for that would send out Kaminga, you're often including Buddy Hield. And with both of those players not really being in the rotation right now, you have, over $30 million just out of the rotation, right? So finding, that's when when the Bucks stretched Damian Lillard, one of the things I said was like, how are you going to be a kind of competitive contending team when you have 15% of your roster or your like available cap space or just roster space just gone. And at this point, the Warriors essentially have 20% of their cap space just being completely not used in the rotation. And so if you are moving on from Kaminga, and as you said, you would be pretty desperate. I think there is a bit of a pitfall there of if you move on from him and don't really get anything great, all of a sudden that roster slot and that salary slot is gone or much more difficult to move or broken up into smaller pieces that could be longer contracts or whatever. It does that risk, like how big of a risk do you think that is?
I I don't see it as a risk because again, unless you feel confident that you can stack Kuminga, Moody, and Buddy Hield, which is $43 million. If you think you can stack those three guys with a pick or two and go get like a star level player, then I guess more power to you. I don't think you can do that. And right now, Jonathan Kuminga isn't playing at all. So right now you've $22.5 million that is doing nothing. So you'd rather have $22.5 million that's doing something.
Yeah.
Uh, because then at least that player becomes more tradable, right? Like if you swap him out for a playable player that's making similar amounts of money, you can still go make that big deal later because you're now trading one playable player as opposed to zero. To me, I think they have to resolve this by the deadline. I think they're setting themselves back more than they already have if they don't.
The other thing is if you do make a move for someone and it's not a like big star, is your team even really good enough to compete? Right? I think saying anything besides Steph Curry has been a million, like just he's been so much better than anyone could have possibly predicted. But despite that, I think it's pretty clear just based off of the standings and kind of just how, watching them and kind of how they've been playing that they're not good enough right now. And I don't think bringing in, players in that kind of a bit above the mid-level range is really going to change their fate that much right now. So if that's the case, do they need to find someone who's actually better than Steph Curry to kind of get back to really being a contending team? And if that's the case, doesn't it make more sense to kind of hold on to Kuminga for now and really kind of aim for that, the big ticket, which is Giannis?
Yeah, you're just taking a big risk. And if you don't get Giannis, which again, right now, as of this moment, as we sit here recording this, Giannis has not requested a trade. In fact, he said in an interview, what was it, a week ago, I'm never requesting a trade. Like that's the most recent Giannis news we have is him telling a reporter in a walk and talk interview that he's never going to request a trade.
Yeah.
So maybe he's lying. In fact, I would even believe that he's lying. Um, but if you're the Warriors, you're taking a massive risk that he both lied to that reporter, is going to request a trade, is going to do it before Steph really falls off, and that he wants to go play for you more than anybody else. That to me is a massive, massive risk. And if any one of those pieces doesn't come to fruition and you don't get him, you are basically sending Steph out sadly. And when it's all said and done, you're not going to be competitive for years after this.
I do think that part of their trepidation in kind of making moves that aren't Giannis, or at least someone who's going to be kind of around long term after Curry, is that they don't want to end up in that kind of just absolute morass of like, we have no picks, we're bad, we're going to be, a bottom feeder for the next 10 years. At least right now, they essentially have all of their picks except for, I think it's 20 through 30 of their like 2027 pick. Let me double check that actually. No.
Yeah, they have all their They have all their own firsts except for 2030,
Yeah. They have
which
all
is
their own first except for 2030, which is goes to Washington if it's between 21 and 30. So they're in a spot where if Curry, if they just kind of let things play out, they do have kind of everything that they need to go into a rebuild and kind of it's not going to be the perfect rebuild where you can trade, some star and get a huge package right away, but it's at least you have your own picks, and when you are bad, you're going to have those high lottery picks. So I think there is a bit of trepidation on the Warriors side to make that big leap, especially because right now they're lined up so perfectly to have, as we were saying earlier, like $150 million in cap space in the summer of 27-28, right? It's it it's a big risk either way, but to me it seems like the safest option is to, like, if you do take that risk of going for Giannis and it doesn't work out, you just kind of, yeah, you're not going to be great, but you can make some moves around the margin. You still have Jimmy Butler and Curry and Draymond. It's at least going to be you know, you do have ostensibly have other, all-star players on the team with Curry. If you do go for someone like, I mean, that's the other question is like, who would you go for with Kuminga? Who's really out there that would be intriguing enough to commit multiple future firsts? I think the one that was kind of always bandied about was the Pelicans and Trey Murphy, but it seems from, all the available reporting that Trey Murphy isn't really available.
yeah. I mean, I don't think the Warriors should be looking to trade Kuminga in some massive deal because I think the amount of picks you'd have to put into a deal to make someone want Kuminga and to give you their superstar is a lot. I think at this point, you just got to trade Kuminga for someone who can play right now. And I don't think there needs to be picks going in either direction. We're talking about Chicago, Sacramento, the Lakers. Those are the teams that have kind of shown interest in Kuminga. And I don't think any one of those teams you need to like send a pick to make that happen. We know the Bulls love player for player trades. So there's definitely a player for player trade you can make there. Like, you know, if you just want to do Kuminga for Vooch, like I don't think that's like the worst thing in the world for the Warriors to do. If you want to do with the Lakers, Kuminga for Rui Hachimura straight up. Like I don't think that's the worst thing in the world for the Warriors. Um I just think they're better off getting a player who can play now because you have the team you have now. There's no guarantees about Giannis. In fact, I would argue it's very unlikely that Giannis ends up a Warrior while Steph Curry is still there because that would require a pretty stark change in tone from Giannis within the next year or two. Um, so I think it's just better to get a playable player now. And if that's Vooch, if that's Rui Hachimura, if in Sacramento, if you could, I don't think you need to throw in a ton of picks, but you could throw in one pick and probably get Keegan Murray. Like there's ways to do this that you don't sacrifice any future flexibility, but you get better now.
I mean, I think if they could go Kuminga and whatever matching salary for and a first for Keegan Murray, I think they would do it in a heartbeat. But I think I don't see why I don't see where Sacramento is like I don't really see the reasoning on Sacramento's part for that one. But I do think your
Well,
idea
that's just assuming
yeah
Sacramento's bad
yeah
at doing things,
that's
which I am.
often a safe assumption. Although I did find your idea of just kind of Rui for Kuminga straight up, at least mildly intriguing. It is a bit awkward with some of the kind of matching salary because the Warrior you'd almost assuredly have to find a third team or send kind of Jake LaRavia or maybe even and Dalton Connect out kind of as well with them and to really make those contracts work. But I do think that is a very kind of interesting idea of just like, let the Lakers kind of take their swing at Jonathan Kuminga and have like a player that's at least capable of standing on the floor, even if it's not, a super high level player. The issue I do see with that is it does kind of leave the Warriors without matching salary for kind of any moves at that point next offseason, unless Rui's interested in a sign and trade.
Yeah, I mean, Rui obviously is an expiring contract. He'll be a free agent this summer. I think, but if you're doing it now, I don't think there's a real need. to like talk with Rui about what the summer holds. Like I think just get a player in now who can do stuff. And I don't think the matching salaries would be that difficult. I mean, I know the Warriors are pretty close to the second apron, the Lakers are pretty close to the first apron. It would pretty much need to be an exact match. And I
Yeah,
think Rui and Connect for Kuminga does that.
I think it does. Yes, nearly
So
perfectly.
I think it's nearly an exact match.
We're off by
To
actually. I think it would be 22.5, and then that would be 22.25.
18.
Yeah, it would
Yeah.
would that put so that's the yeah that would actually that would work really well. That would still leave
Right.
the Lakers just under the first apron hard cap and have enough to easily do the 13 player dance for a while.
Right. So I think that type of stuff, that type of deal really works because um, I think the Lakers have shown in the way they've played Rui Hachimura recently, his minutes are way down, his shot attempts are way down. Um, he's not really a fit with this team. And the Lakers are not a very good front office. And I think they could easily talk themselves into Kuminga being a better fit, even though I don't necessarily think that he is. Um, and getting Rui and Connect in the door in Golden State, it's a fresh start for Connect, who clearly just needs to get away from this franchise. The franchise that has already traded him one time.
The Warriors
Um,
looking for even more two guards.
I don't think he's a good fit there, but like I just think a change of scenery, you're
Yeah,
probably more like the Warriors are more likely to get something good out of Dalton Connect than the Lakers are at this
totally.
stage.
I agree with you completely.
So to me, that type of deal makes sense, and I think the Lakers can talk themselves into Rui's not a fit, Connect's not a fit. Maybe Kuminga can be, and if not, he's at least younger than both those guys.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that makes a lot of sense, but I do think the Warriors do want to hold on to Kuminga's just the flexibility of Kuminga's team option for next year. So I think that is a kind of a very fine balancing act of, is this worth it? How much does this actually help us right now as compared to just kind of holding on to it and seeing where we go for now. But besides these kind of big stories that we've gone through, I think there are a couple of little stories that are interesting to touch on. And one that we kind of mentioned a little bit was the Pelicans. They've kind of made it, at least the public reporting is that they're not really interested in moving on from Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, Jose Alvarado. And while I personally think that's a bit of a mistake, especially on Herb Jones, who has kind of fallen off pretty dramatically offensively and is the kind of player that you can really talk yourself into being a panacea for a lot of problems for a lot of like very good teams. Do you think it's kind of just a mistake for the Pelicans to be kind of shutting down all this talk and kind of pulling out of the trade market entirely already?
Yes, 100%. I think it's almost a colossal error. They like they have 10 wins. Like I don't want to be like disrespectful of the Pelicans, but like they have 10 wins. They're 10-35. And for a 10-win team over 50% of the way through the season to say we're not trading 5 players is it's really crazy to me because that core is clearly not winning you games now. So why do you think that core is going to win you games in 3 years? Like what about this group is going to go from a 10-win team to a 50-win team um, without some serious changes elsewhere? But you can't really make the changes elsewhere because you have a ton of money devoted to these 5 guys. I think it's an insane choice. I get holding on to Derek Queen. I get holding on to Jeremiah Fears. Those are your first round picks. They've looked really promising so far. To me, Herb Jones is 27. Like he's gonna be, by the time you're good enough, he's gonna be 30.
Exactly.
And I just think there's just no reason to hold on to a guy like Herb Jones. Even Trey Murphy, like I think the Pelicans are not in a place as a franchise to have what do they have, like he's like a 4-year $120 million deal still left.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't see that making a ton of sense for them. I think Queen and Fears sell everybody else and focus on those two guys and build around those two guys. That's your best bet at this point.
I mean, I think this is one where kind of the original sin was just kind of trading a bunch of picks willy-nilly, and now they're kind of stuck in a spot where they're not that good. They don't have any pick control going forward. So it's really easy to talk yourself into, oh, let's just try to be good. It's not like there's any harm. But I think there is real harm being done, because the longer you kind of push back this rebuild, or like really having to kind of, I think it's pretty clear at this point that there needs to be kind of a full rebuild in New Orleans. And even if it means moving on from players that are good right now and could maybe help once you start to kind of get to the beginnings of not being awful, it's just, you're just dragging it out and you're making it take longer and longer when you're going to be bad anyway. Just kind of embrace it, get as much as you can, and kind of trade a lot of especially Trey Murphy, trade him kind of at the peak of his value, right? Like he's 25, he's on a reasonably cost controlled contract for a while. This is probably the most value you'll ever get for his contract. So the idea of kind of holding on to him and just being like, oh, we're going to keep it together. We don't have our pick next. Actually, I don't think they have their pick fully controlled next year. I think they have the worst of them.
In 2027, they received the more favorable of Bears and Milwaukee's.
And then the other one goes to Atlanta. So even there, okay, they'll have their own pick, right? Even there, they're why try to be good that year when you do finally have your pick control again, right? Like, you've kind of already committed the original sins. Don't keep throwing, good money after bad.
Right. Like, to me, and you know what? I guess to kind of combat that a little bit, if I'm trying to think from New Orleans' perspective, is they're not good with those guys this year. So who's to say they're going to be good with those guys next year? They might have all those guys and still get a top 5 pick.
Yeah, exactly.
Because this core, it's it's kind of the worst version of what the Raptors were a few years ago, where it's a ton of pieces that in a vacuum on a better team would be really, really solid, but collectively it's terrible. Like, it's just it doesn't work. It doesn't mesh together. And the way you end that type of roster is to break it up.
Yeah.
And to me, I'm not necessarily saying they needed to trade Herb Jones or Trey Murphy at this deadline, but to me, if 2026-27 season starts and both of those guys are still on the New Orleans Pelicans, that's a failure by that front office.
I agree with you completely. So the next little story we wanted to talk about is the Hawks. They still have this Kristaps Porzingis expiring salary, and they've clearly, made kind of the big move. Since they made that move, it has not been going well, but I'm not that worried about that. I think, players have up and down times. I think Jalen Johnson's going to be fine. Is there something that they can do with this Kristaps Porzingis salary slot to either upgrade this year or upgrade for next year, or just kind of do something with it that isn't just letting it expire?
Well, there's always Anthony Davis. I don't think they're going to do that, but there's always Anthony Davis. I think they probably just, to me, it makes more sense to just kind of hold firm. You traded Trae Young. I think you need to give non-Trae Young Hawks some time to see what they can do. And I think Kristaps' expiring salary at this stage, I don't know what it's getting you if not Anthony Davis. And I think there's very good reason not to go for Anthony Davis. So I think you're better off just holding firm and reevaluating in the offseason when you figure to have quite a good amount of flexibility. I think, not a ton of guaranteed contracts.
Yeah, I think with, if they get their roster up to 14 players, they're in the realm of having 39-ish, a little bit under 30, or actually with their first round picks, it'll probably end up being around 25 million in cap space, which lets them really compete for those players that are kind of too good for the mid-level, but, not good enough for a max or anything like that, which is actually kind of a big chunk of how they've built this roster. They have a lot of players kind of in that realm of, Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Okongwu, and Dyson Daniels is going up again next year. I think it's really if you do hold on to Porzingis through this time, fine. Like it becomes a question of is there a number that we could re-sign him at that would actually be intriguing? Do you just let him go completely? He's been such a kind of starstruck player that it's always kind of difficult with him to know what's going to happen. And they have this, a potentially top 3 pick coming in this offseason. It's I do think doing something kind of too early and just rushing in for no real reason could end up backfiring. But it is, expiring salary has kind of had an interesting arc over the past decade or so, where it used to be this just super valuable thing to be able to trade for expiring salary and open up a bunch of cap space for the offseason. And then as we saw cap space become kind of devalued and contract extensions become super popular and kind of in vogue, we saw far less expiring salary. And I think this year especially, there are a bunch of expiring salaries that are kind of like in that $30 million range, right? You have in Atlanta, you have 2 in Porzingis and McCollum. In Boston, you have Anthony Simons. There are a ton of there are like a number of these contracts now that are expiring and you can use to open up flexibility in the offseason. And it's interesting to see that trend kind of reemerge and how that flexibility is going to be used now that far fewer players kind of hit free agency.
Yeah, and like player valuations are all sort of different now too. Like Anthony Simons is going in, like he's probably a guy that a few years ago would have gotten much more than he's going to get. CJ McCollum obviously at one point was a max player, and I think even if he was still towards the peak of his powers, I'm not sure he would be considered a max player in today's NBA. Just like valuations have changed so much, teams are so much more cognizant about like being flexible and not just like giving the max just to give the max. And so I think more players become an option with cap space. So I think there is a bit of a reemergence there. That's part of the reason why.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see how teams kind of use cap space and free agency. And not even what's so interesting is now that I think cap space is much more, you're going to see a lot of teams using cap space to make kind of just unbalanced trades or to let them take back 125% of the, whatever they're sending out to in trades to like that. And I think it'll be interesting to see how this, I was just kind of looking through it. Like there are, 10 to 12 players on, over 15 to 20 million, whose contracts are over 15 to 20 million that are expiring this offseason, and seeing what teams kind of use with that flexibility in cap space. One of the other teams that is, to me, very interesting, just because I think they're one of the teams that could be a real contender this year, is the Nuggets. They obviously don't have that much flexibility, and they've been very hurt recently. Despite that, have been doing shockingly well. Jamal Murray looks to be back to kind of the peak of his powers, which is one of the most exciting things in the league that I don't think has been quite discussed as much as I would have liked. It's really exciting to see him being back to looking like this kind of all-star, like really, really, really excellent point guard. He looks more athletic. He looks more, just so much more dynamic, so much better at creating separation. And despite that, I think it's become quite clear that the Nuggets kind of want some backcourt help. And I think it'll be interesting to see what kind of path they go down with that. And kind of the names that have really popped to me, especially because they're relatively affordable right now, are he's not on Cleveland anymore. He's on Memphis now. So the names that popped to me there are kind of Ty Jerome, who's supposed to come back relatively soon and is only making $8.7 million, and Keon Ellis, who's obviously on a minimum and has been a bit of a darling of mine for the past few years as someone who can really shoot and defend guards. What are your thoughts on what Denver might need or might be looking for to kind of bolster themselves at this deadline?
If they walked away from this deadline with Keon Ellis and did nothing else, that would be awesome. Like that, I think the Nuggets are super well set up to contend this year. I think they are one of 2 teams in the NBA that I think can contend with the Thunder in a 7-game series. And I don't even really think they need to do anything other than get healthy and get Spencer Jones a real contract.
Yeah.
I don't really think they need to do anything, but if they got Keon Ellis, yeah, that would that would make them. I mean, it would be the first time in the Jokic era in Denver that they've been legitimately, I mean, 9 deep, 10 deep
Hmm.
if they had Keon Ellis. It's shocking to think that they're even that close to that after so many years of having such bad depth around Jokic and Murray. Um, and yeah, Murray playing at, I mean, not just an All-Star level. I think you could argue an All NBA
Oh,
level.
definitely.
Um, yeah, I think Denver's very well set up to be a championship contender this year, and I think if they want to add a backup point guard like a Keon Ellis or a Ty Jerome, that's great. That's cherry on top. But if they made no moves but just got healthy and gave Spencer Jones a full contract, I think they're pretty well set.
One of my concerns with the Denver Nuggets is Christian Brown. Actually, I do think I think the little bit that he has played this season has not looked great, and I think it's very likely that he could be a sore spot for the Nuggets when they get into kind of these 7 game series, especially against a team like Oklahoma City, where they're just so intelligent off of with who they help off of, and they're so aggressive helping off of people. Having a player that is so reluctant to shoot and is supposed to fill kind of one of the spots on the floor that is supposed to be a strong shooter, even though they have done a very good job of filling in other strong shooters around them. I think having more guard options that can really, force the Nuggets to, or force like a team like OKC to really have to stick to their guys a little bit more could be really useful.
Yeah, I think it's hard with Christian Brown because I think injuries have obviously piled up this year. He played 11 games before his first injury, and then he came back, tried to play a couple games, re aggravated. It's been a very injury riddled year. I don't think that this is who Christian Brown is. Um, I mean, his last 2 seasons, he shot 39.7 and 38.4% from beyond the arc. I think it's not in high volume. He's never been a high volume 3 point shooter. But if he's at least hitting at 37, 38%, it forces teams to still have to play on him, and they can't just like completely leave him alone. Uh and I just think the injuries have played a major factor in his performance so far this year. I just I'm choosing to believe that the version from the last 2 seasons is who Christian Brown is and not what we're seeing so far this year.
Yeah, I could buy that argument. I do think it would be nice for the Nuggets to have kind of another backcourt guy who can, especially if you go the Ty Jerome route, someone who can kind of create a bit of offense and be a little more dynamic. The next story, which we've already kind of touched on a little bit, is the Mavericks. It's a bit of a kind of sad and lost situation at this point where everyone's hurt. Even PJ Washington, who isn't tradable, has had an ankle sprain since the beginning of the season. But they do have a couple players who are tradable and the ones that I want to talk about are Daniel Gafford and Najee Marshall. I think especially, well, let's start with Daniel Gafford. Daniel Gafford is one of the players that Dallas could move, and especially given that there are a couple of teams that are looking to kind of solidify their center spot going forward. One of the ones that I've heard kind of bandied around recently is Boston, kind of going for a bit of a Gafford Lively thing with Gafford and Neemias Queta, or even throwing in Luka Garza in there. I think there's some interesting things there. I think the salary matching could be a little difficult for them if it's not Anthony Simons going to a third team. Indiana's the other one that I've thought about. Is there anyone on Indiana's roster that could be particularly interesting for Dallas? Do you have any thoughts on Gafford and where he might work, or even if it's worth it for Dallas to move on from him if Dallas is going to try to be better again next year?
Yeah, I mean, Dallas is in such an interesting spot because this is their last year of pick control for a little while. They kind of have to be bad this year. But trading Gafford puts you in the tough spot of now your only centers are Derek Lively and Anthony Davis.
Ouch.
And neither one of them is playing more than 45 games in a season, uh, probably ever,
Yeah.
ever again. So you're in a tough spot where Gafford's kind of your lone reliable big, but you need to be as bad as possible this year. there's no benefit to winning 38 games and losing in the play-in. Um, so I think that puts the Mavericks in a really tough spot where if they trade Gafford, they could probably get a decent amount for him, but then they need to use whatever they get to go get another center because they can't have AD and Derek Lively as their only centers moving forward.
Yeah.
So that's where it's tough. But I think trading Gafford, this is probably among the highest value he's ever going to be. He's 27. He's been a solid player for them for a couple of years now. I think his value is not getting any higher. So probably should trade him.
As soon as possible.
Now. Yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, we have Najee Marshall, who's on a very cheap contract and is kind of the classic archetype of a player that fits pretty seamlessly almost everywhere, even if he's not quite a high, I wouldn't even quite classify him as like a low end starter, but he is a very easy to fit in kind of backup wing who can defend reasonably well, can shoot reasonably well, is kind of okay at everything. Is there anywhere that you think would be particularly interested in Najee Marshall? And if so, kind of how much would it cost for that team to try to bring in Najee now? And what would you accept as Dallas?
Yeah, I think Najee Marshall, I think any team in the league would like to have a player like Najee Marshall. I think if you're looking at teams this year that make sense, like I think San Antonio could make a lot of sense. I think even a Raptors could make some sense. I think any team that like feels like they're on the precipice of the next level, I think getting in as many guys as possible to have, because we're entering an era in the NBA where depth wins over having the best 1 through 3 in a series, but the worst 4 through 10.
Mm-hmm.
Depth is really important now, and I think if you're a team that's like feels like you're right on the precipice, going and getting a cheap depth piece like Najee Marshall makes a lot of sense. I think even the Timberwolves could benefit from having a guy like him. There's just so many teams in that like second tier of the NBA that could benefit in having him, and he's a guy that I think more than Gafford, Dallas should feel some form of motivation to trade. He's 28, and you're not really going to be a championship contender next season. So there's no real need to have a guy like that on your team right now. And if you can get a little bit worse now, you do that. So I think if they could get like, it's hard to see a team giving up like lightly protected, but if there's like a lottery protected first out there, I think Najee Marshall is worth that type of ask. He's right in the square of his prime, and I think he can help any team right now.
Yeah, I think, he's one of the players that I think would make a lot of sense for like the Lakers to go after, right? If you could go either, Jared Vanderbilt or Maxi Kleber going out and kind of bring in a third team, this is where Brooklyn's kind of remaining cap space could be really useful. Also, all of these players fit into mid-level trade exceptions, so they're relatively easy to move around for any teams that kind of have enough space underneath the tax. So I think if you could do, how is the Lakers' seconds?
I don't think the Lakers have many seconds.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure they have like 2 total.
That's tough. But yeah, if the Lakers would be interested in kind of giving out a super one of their firsts in like 5 years for for Najee Marshall, or any of the teams that, like you mentioned, that are kind of just on the prefaces, right? Minnesota could go with Mike Conley going out, or Rob Dillingham and Terrence Shannon Jr. or something like that, right?
That to me is the trade. Like if it's like a Rob Dillingham plus for Najee Marshall, like that's a trade I do if I'm Minnesota. If I'm the Spurs, I think there's probably something in there with Sohan.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's definitely deals out there, and I think Dallas should be more motivated to trade Najee Marshall than Daniel Gafford.
On that front, what would be the kind of least amount of pick value that you would be willing to accept for that? Is it 2 seconds where one of them's pretty good and the other one's not so great? Is it 2 like solid seconds? Is it What's the lowest you would go?
I think since we're on the top, since we mentioned the Lakers, I'm like in my head I'm comparing it to like Kendrick Nunn and 3 seconds for Rui Hachimura, like that type of deal.
Yeah.
I think is the lowest I would go because Najee Marshall plays defense too.
Yeah.
So like he's not as good offensively as Rui Hachimura is, but like he plays defense. He's a little more valuable as a two-way wing. To me, like 3 seconds, that kind of deal, that Kendrick Nunn in 3 seconds deal, is kind of the baseline for Najee Marshall. But I think a team could talk themselves into a lottery protected or top 20 protected first
Definitely.
for Najee Marshall.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's where we're going to call it for today. Thank you for coming on. Any last words? Anything you want to shout out before we call it?
No, I appreciate you having me on, and well, I'm sure I'll be back on again soon.
Yes, almost definitely. Yeah. Again, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for everyone for listening. Don't forget to leave a review, follow, leave a comment. We always love to hear feedback and just what you guys are thinking. Always want to start a conversation. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time.